So we've been in the Old Testament, now we're in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1. And Luke is the only evangelist who begins his gospel with the birth announcement of John the Baptist. He's the only one who begins with that story. Before we're introduced to this important couple, namely Zechariah and Elizabeth, and the expected child, John, Luke starts with words that we might easily overlook. In the days when King Herod was king of Judea. So we're going to pick up the story, Luke chapter 1. There's quite a bit that I'm going to read, so prepare yourselves. Luke chapter 1, beginning in verse 5. I'm going to read verses 5 through 25, and then 57 through 80. So quite a lot of Luke chapter 1. In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. He had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child. Does that sound familiar? Because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now, while he was serving as priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him. Fear fell upon him, but the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. You'll have joy and gladness. Many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. And he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he'll be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. And he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared." And Zechariah said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I'm an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." And the angel answered him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time." And the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them. And they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, and he kept making signs to them, but he remained mute. And when his time of service was ended, he went to his home. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden, saying, "Thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me, to take away my reproach among people." Literally, to take my shame away. Now we jump ahead to chapter 1, verse 57. We're skipping over Mary and Joseph and their announcement. We'll talk about that next Sunday. Spoiler alert, Christmas Eve, we're going to talk about the Christmas story. Chapter 1, verse 57. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth. So we fast forwarded 9 months. I guess 4 months, because they told us she was in silence for 5 months. So we're going to tack on 4 more months. Now it's time for the birth. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. And on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child. And they would have called him Zechariah after his father, but his mother answered, "No, he shall be called John." And they said to her, "None of your relatives is called by that name." And they made signs to his father, inquiring what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet, and this is what he wrote: "His name is John." And they all marveled or wondered. And immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue loosed, and he spoke, blessing God. And fear came on all their neighbors. And all these things were talked about through all the hill country of Judea. And all who heard them laid them up in their hearts, saying, "What then will this child be? For the hand of the Lord was with him." His father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit, and he prophesied, saying, and what I read to follow is the song of Zechariah. It's a song of praise. "Blessed be the Lord, God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people. He's raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from of old, that we would be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show the mercy promised to our fathers, to remember his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our father Abraham, to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve God without fear, in holiness and righteousness before God all of our days. And you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his way, to give knowledge of salvation to his people and the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, whereby the sunrise shall visit us from on high, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. And the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he was in the wilderness until the day of his public appearance to Israel. This is the word of our Lord. Thanks be to God. So Luke is the only one who tells that story, at least with all that detail. And he starts with those words way back in verse 5, when it said, in the days when King Herod was the ruler of Judea. Herod was king. Herod the Great. How many of you are familiar with Herod the Great? Raise your hands. No, not really? Or yes, but you don't want to raise your hand? It's probably that one. How many of you have heard of Herod the Great? We'll try again. Okay, so you've heard of him. He's not just in the Bible. Herod the Great is famous in secular history. He's not actually Jewish. He's by definition Idumean. Idumean means he's from the territory of the Edomites. He's a descendant of Edom, so he's not really Jewish technically. And he ruled the region of Judea from around 40 BC to 4 BC. His allegiance was to Rome, not to Israel. Although he rebuilt the Temple of Solomon, he also built a lot of other places of worship, of false gods. He enacted idolatrous practices among the Jewish people. It would seem that King Herod didn't worship the God of Israel or adhere to the law of Moses. He really just was not Jewish in any way. He was, in fact, a charlatan, a fake. And that's how all of his people felt about him, even the ones who were afraid to say so. Secular historians acknowledge Herod for his evil reign. He was violent, paranoid. They used to say life was more secure for Herod's pigs than for his own sons. Think about that. He was so paranoid, he would do anything necessary to protect his own interests, to promote his own greatness. He was everything wrong with an earthly king. Think of Saul in the Old Testament, the first king of Israel, who seems to be great, and we find out he's really insecure and always projecting on everybody all the time. God says to him, you are a great man, but you feel like you're so little. That's Herod. He's worse than Saul. At least Saul kind of cared about God. Herod seems to have no affiliation with the God of Israel. He's just a bad guy. He's an evil ruler. It was said, as long as Herod was on the throne, no woman's honor was safe and no man's life was secure. Herod was a bad man. Technically, he, a bad man, is leading God's people. So when Luke begins at the time when Herod was the king of Judea, that's not just a moment in history. It's a turn of phrase. We're supposed to read when things were really bad for Israel, at a time when it seemed like all hope was being lost, at a time when it was dark and we weren't sure there was going to be a way out. In the darkest and most evil days that God's people could remember, that's how we ought to read that phrase. So that's where Luke begins, in those dark and terrible days when Herod was our king. Maybe you could think of a time in your own life that would start that way, when things were really bad, when it was dark, and we weren't sure if we'd ever find a way out. I don't know what that time would be in your life, but maybe you already have a time like that. That's where Luke takes us. He takes us to that tough place, to the moment when we feel like there may not be a way out, when things are really grim and ugly. Enter Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah is a priest to the true God. Elizabeth, his wife, is the daughter of priestly men. So we find out they're connected to the priestly work of the temple. They are close with God. They're not like Herod. These are good people. In fact, the Bible says they are righteous. Tzaddikim, they are righteous ones. They walk with God. They do what is right. They're just people. We could imagine they care for the poor and the needy. They serve their neighbors. They are kind and patient and forgiving. They're not perfect, of course, they're human, but they are trying to honor God, and we're meant to respect them. They're acknowledged as blameless before the Lord. Now, that would be surprising to the original audience because they are also immediately labeled childless. And you may not know this because we live in the modern medically aware world. Childlessness for us is a physiological, biological issue, right? We don't think someone who can't have a child is cursed, but they used to. In the ancient Near East, that's pretty much what everyone believed. They used an ugly word, barren. It's stark, a word for women who were unable to have children. Those who couldn't were assumed to be sinful or somehow wicked or broken and therefore punished by God. So if you didn't have a child by the time you were advanced in years, people assumed you must not be a very good person. Barrenness carried shame along with it. To be labeled barren was for a woman like Elizabeth to not live up to your potential. It was to not fulfill your obligation to your husband and your family lineage. It was to lose sense of purpose. So now we begin not only when politically things are dark, but even personally things are tough. Now I know you can think of a time in your life that felt that way, when the circumstances you were in were not good, and when you yourself felt that you weren't living up to your potential, when things weren't as they ought to be for you. Now, we've come a long way in 2,000 years, but we still wouldn't want to use the word barren today because it feels shameful. Not only for women without children, but for men and women who remain unmarried into their adult lives. We still sometimes judge those single people as if something's wrong with them. Why are they not married yet? Why don't they have a family yet? For people who struggle day after painful day with chronic illness, and we wonder, why aren't they getting better? What's going on? I mean, there are lots of examples where we associate shame with people suffering. Suffering's bad enough, you don't need to add shame on top of it. But that's what we do. Whether we do it in our own minds or we project it onto other people, we connect the two, shame and suffering. Everyone who senses that somehow feels that they're not living up to their purpose, that something's wrong with them. And so we cling to Zechariah and Elizabeth because they're going to show us a way out. We can relate to Elizabeth in particular. We feel like something should be different, either in our world or in our own hearts. So we stand before God, and maybe with feelings of bitterness or anger or resentment. God, what have you done? Maybe feelings of guilt. God, what did I do to deserve this? Why is this happening to me? Maybe a mixture of the two. God, what have you done, and why is it being done to me? And so we wait in that dark, desperate, painful place. We wait for God. We wait. And it's hard to wait on God's presence. It's hard to hope for good news when all the news you've gotten has seemed to be bad. So already in the first verses, we see the problems developing. Socially, there's a deep darkness in the land of Judea. Personally, this couple lives in a shadow. They live in darkness. And their names remind us of the desperation of the moment and the painful need for hope. This part you probably don't know, and that is the Hebrew of the names. So Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah means God remembers, or the Lord remembers. So Yah is short for Yahweh. Zachar means to remember. So Zechariah means remember the Lord. But we say it backwards in English. So we would say the Lord will remember. The Lord remembers. That's literally the name, Zechariah. The Lord remembers. Now this is a man who feels forgotten after years of faithfulness. And his name stands above him prophetically. The Lord remembers. And then he's married to a woman named Elizabeth. And Elisheva is the origin of Elizabeth. English doesn't do a great job with that. Elisheva just doesn't sound the same, right? Anyone here who's named Elizabeth, you probably don't want people to call you Elisheva. But that's actually the origin of your name. Elisheva, Eli means my God. You remember Jesus on the cross says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is my God, why have you forsaken me? Eli means my God, and then Sheva means an oath or a promise. So my God is a promise, or my God keeps a promise. That's the insinuation. So their names together literally mean God remembers God's promise, or the Lord my God remembers every promise. Well, that's pretty cool. So this married couple, when pieced together, even in their prophetic naming, represent the hope that they need, that God will remember the promises that God has made. It should be encouraging to us that God would choose an unlikely couple like Elizabeth and Zechariah to begin telling the story of Christmas, at least in Luke's gospel. The good news of God's presence, the story of the birth of Jesus, begins in a most unexpected place, in the womb of a woman who's labeled barren and advanced in years. The very place of Elizabeth's deepest pain becomes the place of God and his prophetic work. So God takes the painful thing and he makes it beautiful. He takes the ugly thing and makes it attractive. Not in spite of her barrenness, but because of it. And I can't help but think God can do that for you. That God can take the place of your pain, the thing in your life that hurts you the most, the thing that feels most empty, depleted, barren, and turn that pain into blessing. But to get from pain to promise is a hard path, and it involves a lot of painful waiting. For centuries, God's people had been waiting. They had waited for God to come near to them in a special way, to take away their sorrow, to replace it with joy, to take away their sin and replace it with forgiveness, to take away the barrenness of death and replace it with abundant life. And so God begins with Elizabeth. The life within Elizabeth acts as a promise of everything God was about to do for Israel. She would receive, in part, what God intended to bring to all of humanity. And that's because she is the daughter of priest and married to a priest. And the priests are the intercessors. They stand between God and the people. So God chooses a couple who stands between him and the people, and he says, they will be a picture to all the people of what I am about to do. The life within her is a promise. Elizabeth is bringing hope to all of humanity, wholeness, healing, joy. Elizabeth would not be the one to bring God into the world. That's next week with Mary. And yet her miracle baby, Elizabeth's baby, would prepare the way for the coming of the Lord. John would be perhaps the most important figure in the New Testament, apart from Jesus himself. The time of waiting was over. Their son will be named John, and he will be deemed great before the Lord. Because as their names remind us, God remembers God's promise. But, as you might expect, Zechariah has his doubts. As we read, he's told by the angel Gabriel what's about to happen, and he questions. He finds it difficult to believe. Perhaps after so many decades of waiting, he had lost the heart to keep hoping. Some of you know what it's like to have your hopes dashed over and over and over again. And eventually it hurts to hope. So you stop hoping. You just give up. You become a nihilist, a fatalist. You just accept things as they are. This is just the way it's going to be. And that may seem like the easy way out. Maybe that's where Zechariah is. So when the angel Gabriel tells him that Elizabeth is going to become pregnant, he balks. He says, I'm old. She's old. We never had a kid yet. How can this be? And Gabriel doesn't seem to get angry or defensive. He seems to understand the doubt. And so he responds and says, you don't know who I am. I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God every day. And I've come to tell you the message of God. I have authority to tell you this. I'm a messenger of God himself. And so the angel helps Zechariah listen a little better the next time around, ironically, by making him unable to speak. 9 months of muteness are imposed on Zechariah. That's a weird part in the story, isn't it? I mean, if you were listening, you probably thought, well, that's a little weird. This great couple doing all the right things. They've already suffered for years without a child, shamed for being childless and barren. Now finally they're going to get a kid. God says, I'm going to bless you with a child, and I'm going to punish you with muteness for 9 months. You're not going to be able to speak. It seems a little weird. I imagine the angel knew that for Zechariah, finding words to explain whatever had just happened would be impossible. Given the political climate, talking about it might even be dangerous. We know what Herod's going to do later, right? After the birth of Christ, within a couple of years, he sends soldiers to slaughter the innocents of Bethlehem, all those under 2 years old. Herod's not a good man. Zechariah would have placed himself in immediate danger by telling this story. I don't think the angel is annoyed with Zechariah. I don't think there's angel ego involved. And he says, you know what, since you don't like what I had to say, I'm going to punish you. I almost think, and this is a bit of a reach, but I think it's an act of mercy. And I've come to believe that about a lot of things in life, that things that seem like punishments from God are sometimes just severe mercy. And sometimes I need severe mercy. Gabriel gives his credentials, and then in this act of perhaps severe mercy, he says, with the grace of God, you're not going to be able to talk about this until the baby's born. And by then, you'll have plenty to say, and what you say will be meaningful. It will literally be read by people in Gallia County, Ohio, 2,000 years later. It'll be that meaningful. So speechless, Zechariah would have to hold all of this in, unable to explain what had happened. In the mercy of silence, he wouldn't have to. He could feel and pray and wonder and suspend and relinquish whatever he thought he knew. In wordless mystery, Zechariah is accessible to the more of God, that godness that we can't really explain or talk about, the kind that's only received in love. In speechlessness, in silence, he can hear the heartbeat of God. Love moves in. It was that love that took Zechariah home. It took him home to his wife. And I imagine gossip moved quickly in the ancient Near East, even though they didn't have iPhones and things. They could spread word of mouth quickly. People whispered, lots of whispering. And I imagine in his neighborhood, people already knew that something weird had happened at the temple that day. By the time Zechariah cleans up and gets home, everybody knows Elizabeth has probably heard something weird happened today with your husband at the temple. So when his time of service is over and he is ready to go home, it must have been a consolation to see his wife waiting for him with open arms. He comes home and he sees Elizabeth, the woman that he's been married to for all these years, yet without a child. The other co-sufferer, the one who's been with him through all these trials, faithful to him for all these years. One that he wouldn't have to speak to. They've been married long enough, his wordlessness wasn't a hindrance. They knew each other. She could sense what he was feeling. And Elizabeth was probably relieved to see him walking up, having heard whatever gossip might have made it to her by that time. I imagine she met him with fresh water on the path home, had a meal already prepared, dismissed the servants, served him on her own, spent time with him at the table. In time, he'd find a way to let her know what had happened. He couldn't tell her, but he would find a way. She would understand eventually. But for her, it would have been enough that right now he looked at her as he had not looked at her in so many years, with hope, with gratitude, with wonder. She probably knew he'd want to bathe and change clothes, that he'd finally drop his exhausted body somewhere on a couch or a bed and pass out. So imagine her surprise when he adorns himself as a bridegroom and anoints himself with oil and comes to their bedroom chambers and takes her up into his arms. You almost don't want to interrupt these old lovers in this quiet moment. Something is happening. Something profound and beautiful is happening. And the Bible doesn't take us into the intimate details. It doesn't have to. We know something beautiful is happening. God is blessing these people because the Lord our God remembers every promise. That's their names. That is Elizabeth and Zechariah. We tiptoe into the passage. We don't want to disturb them. And at the same time, we're in awe of God's persistence, this unrelenting faithfulness to a promise. Divine desiring. Longing love. God's hope for us that gives us hope for ourselves. For 5 months, Elizabeth remains in seclusion, pregnant but unable to talk to anyone about it. She could hear the heartbeat of God within her. Within her womb, love was growing strong. Zechariah already knew all the biblical stories of God giving children to previously barren women. We've talked about some of those stories, haven't we? The patriarchs of old. We know the stories in the Bible of God blessing older barren couples with children after so many years of waiting. But it's one thing to intellectually know about the promise of God. It's another thing to actually experience it, isn't it? It's different. A lot of you know a lot about the Bible, but that doesn't mean you've experienced it. There is a difference. God had done this with every patriarch. I think of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel. There's a difference, though, when it's your wife. Zechariah knew, but he didn't really know. In those 9 months, he learned how to hope again. So when John is finally born, Zechariah erupts in praise for everything that God has done, everything that God would do. This wasn't just present hope, it was future hope. Through his son, and ultimately through Jesus, the one his son would welcome. God would provide for his people, in verse 68, redemption. In verse 72, mercy. In verse 77, forgiveness. In verse 79, not just for Israel, but for all the nations of the earth, peace, wholeness, restoration. I said something a moment ago, I think it's pretty profound. I'm going to say it again. There's a difference between knowing God's promise intellectually and waiting on God's promise personally. Some of you know the difference. Some of you know what it's like to wait patiently on God to keep his promise. Elizabeth and Zechariah had this promised child, John the Baptist. That's what we call him. Baptist means dipper or dunker, so John the Dunker. And of course, he's famous because he dunked people in the Jordan River. He baptized them. This child of promise was pointing to everything God was about to do through Jesus for the whole world. Wholeness, healing, forgiveness, joy. But we would have to wait for these promises to be fulfilled. I realize when we talk about waiting, and that's what we talk about in Advent, every week of the Christmas season, that's what we talk about, is waiting. That's what Advent means. It means someone's coming. So until someone comes, you have to wait until they show up. So it's waiting and waiting. And waiting is hard. When you talk about waiting, you're opening up a can of worms. You're wading, W-A-D-I-N-G, into deep waters, right? Pun intended. Some of you didn't get that one. Time is precious. Time is the only commodity you can't get more of, right? You can't buy any more time. You can't earn it. You can't win it. There is no more time than the time you have. So when you're waiting for something in the future, whether with relief or joy or anxiety or fear, that waiting is difficult. Whether it's good or bad, it's hard to wait. I hate waiting in lines. I hate it. The BMV, theme parks, the grocery store, whatever. Is like the first of the month at Walmart. Good Lord. Nobody wants to wait in lines. Nobody wants to wait. And sometimes it feels beneath me to have to wait. I'm better than these people. I don't have to stand in line with these people. That's a joke. That's a joke. I'll share a quick caveat. The Green, this is not because I'm better, but I think I'm a little bit smarter sometimes. At Green School, there is a place to drop your kids off every morning, and that place continues with a sidewalk quite a bit further than where everybody seems to stop. I don't get it. I want to put up a sign that says, pull around. It is equidistance to the door from the left or the right, but everybody stops back here and backs up traffic. Pull all the way around. Your kids will walk the same distance to the door from here as they do from back here. Just pull around. Then you have 3 or 4 more car links you could fit there. It's baffling to me. Okay. I don't like to wait. But, there's always a but. As we said a week ago, 2 weeks ago, as we keep saying, patience is a virtue for a reason. It's important to wait. Waiting doesn't just build character. It creates opportunity. It prepares us for what is to come. It exaggerates the greatness of the thing that we're waiting on, or it minimizes the pain of it if we're prepared by waiting. Whatever it is, waiting helps. Patience is a virtue for a reason. It's important. It's just hard. It's hard to wait, but it's good. Somehow it's good. I don't know how. But it's good, okay? God says so I have to believe it. Advent is basically a month-long time of me thinking about how waiting can somehow be good. Because every year I need God to keep reminding me that somehow this is good. Waiting. That's what we're doing now, isn't it? Waiting for the return of Christ. And somehow that is good. They had this problem in the Bible. People in the biblical times, people would say, Jesus isn't back yet. You said he was going to come back. Where is he? And Peter says, some of these people don't understand. They think that God is slow, but he's not. He's patient because he doesn't want anyone to perish. God is loving and kind. Don't think he's slow. Recognize it as patience. Well, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I think he's being slow. And so do you. And that's why we need Advent, so we can be honest about it and say waiting, it's terrible. It's not fun. the Lord our God remembers every promise. That's Zechariah and Elizabeth. So when we read the abbreviated account of her labor, when we jump ahead to 57, the birth of her son, we know, first of all, it's written by a man. There are no details about the labor and delivery at all. Not even one word about how she gave birth or what the experience was like. I've been at all three of my children's births, and I have lots of words to share with you. The breathing, the walking and pacing, the yelling, the clawing, the hours. Kylie was all natural, so it was lots of clawing. How long the pushing lasted. Does he look like his dad? Was the cord wrapped around his neck? Was it scary? Did he come out peacefully? Was it fine? Did he cry right away? There's none of that. But we do jump ahead. 8 days later, it was good and right for their neighbors, their friends, to show up for his dedication at the temple. He's there. He's ready to be circumcised and anointed and named. This is a big deal for little boys in Israel. And so we sense encroachment. It's good that they're there, but then they start to say, we think he ought to be Zech Jr. Name him like his daddy, Zechariah Jr. I'm a Joe Jr., so I get it. It's great, and sometimes it wasn't great, because you know, when people say Joe, which one are they talking to? My dad's name was Joe. So I get the lineage, the history. It's powerful. It's a legacy, right? You carry on a name, sometimes first and last name. So they're saying he ought to be Zechariah just like his dad. He's a righteous man. Let's name him after his father. And Elizabeth finally speaks up and says, no, his name is John. And the people say, you're merely a woman, okay? It doesn't matter if it's your baby. We're not going to listen to you. No one in your family's named John. We're not doing that. And so they scramble and they think, what other name could we pick? And then they motion to Zechariah and they try to sign to him, and none of them know sign language. So they're all just making motions, and he gets a tablet and he says, his name is John. Listen to her. His name is John. And then they say, apparently reluctantly, okay, fine. We'll name him John. But there's a lot in a name. We know that because of Zechariah and Elizabeth. And we'll talk about John next week. And we'll talk about Jesus next week. And if you don't know the name Jesus, Yeshua, I'll tell you next week. He is to be called John. I love the phrasing in Greek. It's weird. They don't say his name is John or his name shall be John. It's literally he is to be called John, like a pet name, like a nickname. That's what people are going to call him. Zechariah, as soon as he agrees to this and declares the end of God's promise, the child would come and his name would be John. That's done. The child is dedicated. He's ready to roll. Then all of a sudden, his mouth is open and he begins to praise. He offers this beautiful prayer and song. The good news of God's presence, the story of Jesus' birth, begins in a most unexpected place, in the womb of a barren woman. Perhaps the good news of God in your life is going to show up in an unexpected place. Maybe that's another lesson for the Advent season. Maybe it could happen for you. Maybe it's already happening for you. The birth of John the Baptist is a promise of everything God is about to do through Jesus, offering wholeness, healing, forgiveness, and joy to the whole world. And yet all these wonderful gifts come from unexpected places. Don't underestimate God. Don't underestimate God. Don't assume that where you are barren, no fruit could ever come. Because God can do it. God has done it. God has to do it because it's in the names. God will remember God's promise. Would you stand with me as we close? Zechariah's song points out all these beautiful blessings. And yet, before he sings this song, we see the people scoffing. There are always scoffers. There are always people who will doubt God's promise, especially if they've been waiting and God hasn't kept the promise. It's easy to doubt. It's easy to scoff. There will always be scoffers. The people want to know. And I want to be angry at the people who scoff at God, but I get it because God has been so quiet. That's the point of the muteness of Zechariah, is that literally he's silent. It's a figure of God's silence. It's a metaphor in a very real sense that God hasn't been talking. If you don't know, by the time John the Baptist comes on the scene, God hasn't spoken through a prophet in around 400 years. Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, was around 400 years before the birth of Jesus. So for 400 years, God hasn't really been talking like he used to. It's been quiet. All is quiet on the Israeli front. And God speaks. After all this silence, God speaks. But if God isn't speaking, if your prayers keep hitting that imaginary ceiling, if God feels far away, distant, like he's not hearing you, that is tough. And when God doesn't answer, you ask again and again, and God never answers you, it's tough. It's hard to hope in the midst of patient silence. Sometimes you just need a word from God. And so when Zechariah finally speaks, it's good. It's a balm to the soul. It's healing. It's healing for God's people. The Apostle Paul talks about this. He says that waiting on God is like the pangs of labor. How appropriate that we keep talking about barren women who suddenly have to go through the pangs of labor. It's the suffering of barrenness and then the pangs of giving birth. But then finally, after all the waiting and all the suffering, there is the joy, the beauty of it. He says that in Romans 8, that all creation is groaning in the pangs of child labor, just waiting to give birth to this new future, this beautiful thing that God is doing. But right now we're waiting. We're in the hallways, walking and pacing with a little IV bag on the thing that rolls, and try not to trip over the cords while you're also trying to heavy breathe and panting and the tension in the gut-wrenching pain. And then there's moments of peace and everything's kind of quiet and then more contractions. And it's all of that waiting and the pain of it. That's where we are. Paul says that's what it's like to live right now in this world. It's the waiting. But there is hope. There is hope something really profoundly beautiful is coming. And it will all be worth it in the end. So you can wait. You can hold on. So let's be real for just a moment. I want to ask you a couple of questions as we close. This Advent season, where are you waiting on God? Because I know you are. There's something in your life where you feel like God still hasn't done what you thought God would do by now, or God just hasn't shown up in that aspect, that area of your life. And I don't want you to overly compartmentalize your life, but there have to be places, right, where you feel barren. Where do you feel barren right now? Where do you feel like you're not living up to your purpose? Like God hasn't helped you find what you're supposed to be or supposed to do? I know there's something in you that just hasn't clicked. Where is that thing? What is that thing? Where are you barren? Where are you waiting? Where do you feel empty? And it's been so long. God speaks through Zechariah and Elizabeth to you today and says, I keep my promises. Always. I always keep my promises. God remembers God's promise. The good news at the end of the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth is that everyone shares in rejoicing. Even the scoffers become rejoicers. The neighbors, the relatives who wrongly judged this couple for years, who tried to force the wrong name upon the baby, all these people end up as rejoicers, celebrants of what God is doing. God does that all the time. God leads even doubters to be worshipers. God has done it for me. He's done it for some of you. So we read the story again. When Herod was king, Zechariah and Elizabeth, or we might say it this way in your story, when things were darkest and hope was hard to find, God remembered God's promise. And God has promised. There's a way out, a light shining in the wilderness, in the darkness. That is the ministry of John. It points to the light of Christ. And we know Jesus is more than a way out. He's not only the way, but he's truth itself. He is the access point to abundant life. That's why John tells us he's the way, the truth, and the life. Emmanuel, God with us. Would you pray with me? And today I'll use another one of Henry Nouwen's prayers from that great devotional. Dear Lord, today I thought of the words of Vincent van Gogh. It's true. There's an ebb and flow, but the sea remains the sea. God, you are the sea. And although I experience many ups and downs in my emotions, I often feel great shifts and changes in my inner life. You remain the same. Your sameness is not the sameness of a rock. It's the sameness of a faithful lover. Out of your love, I came to life. By your love, I am sustained. And to your love, I am always called back. There are days of sadness, and there are days of joy. There are feelings of guilt, and there are feelings of gratitude. There are moments of failure and moments of success, but all of them are embraced by your unwavering love. My only real temptation is to doubt in your love. to think of myself as somehow beyond the reach of your love, to remove myself from the healing radiance of your love. To do these things is to move into the darkness of despair. O Lord, sea of love and goodness, let me not fear too much the storms and the winds of daily life. Let me know there is ebb and flow, but that the sea remains the sea. Amen.